we go. Good evening and welcome again to our Bible study, the study of angels. And we are this evening going to be talking about something that's a bit unusual, certainly unusual to be included in what you might call to be a Bible study. But we'll tackle that here in just a moment. So where we're going to start is in Genesis chapters 4 and 6. So at the very beginning of your Bibles is where we're going to start. But actually, I'm going to cheat. And it's probably better to actually start in Revelation. And then we're going to go back to Genesis. So it's probably better to start in Revelation, which is the last book in the Bible, the tail end of your Bible, chapter 12. Revelation chapter 12. So we'll give you a minute to get to that. And if you don't get to it, because we're just going to read a few verses, and I could read them to you if you don't want to, or if you don't have the ability to look it up. Revelation chapter 12 and in verse 7. So mine has a little subheading at the top that says Michael defeats the dragon. That's what mine says. But I'll go ahead and read this for you to save you some time. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated. And there was no longer any place for them in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. So this is the last book of the Bible, so it's kind of the conclusion, and it's describing sort of the in multiple ways, it describes the victory overall of good over evil. And it happens in a series of things. What we just read, it depends on what your specific theology is, whether this is something that already happened, and if it already happened, when it happened. Did it happen at the beginning of time, or was it something that happened later on in history, or is this something that has not happened yet? So the Christian view, the Hebrew view, is that this has already happened. And depending on what your specific theology might be, and if you don't know what your theology is on this, and that's okay. So I'll tell you the two different perspectives. One is that this happens sometime in ancient history, towards the beginning of time, that the angelic warfare was something that happened early on in humankind. Or the second view is that this victory takes place upon Christ's resurrection. That when Jesus is resurrected and defeats death, which is supposed to be the final evil's final thing that they can do, can't do anything else, is that is when this takes place. And so those are the two in general views, just depending on where it is that you want to be. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to go back to the beginning of the Bible, to Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4. And actually, I think I'm going to be in 5, aren't I? Yeah, I'm going to be in 5, essentially. And so just a brief recap of what happens in the first 4 chapters of Genesis is that God creates the world, which includes Adam and Eve, the first man and woman. The first man and woman disobey God, creating the first sin. Before that, there was no sin because there was never any disobedience. And their disobedience was that they plucked the apple from the tree, but it wasn't an apple tree. And it probably wasn't even a fruit tree. That probably wasn't the case. The point was that God said, the only thing you need not do, the only thing you don't need to do is to pick from that or take from that or participate in that, whatever that happens to be. And so when humankind takes from the tree, that becomes the first time that we said no to God, and then sin enters the world. And they take from the tree because they're tempted by this tempter, this adversary, whom we also often call Satan or Lucifer or the deceiver or whatever you want to call it. They're tempted, and the temptation is this, is that if you take from the tree, you will be like God, knowing the difference between good and evil. Well, until that point in time, there was no evil on the surface of the earth. So no, they did not know the difference between good and evil because there was no evil in which to contend for humankind's purpose. Does that make sense? Once they take that, indeed, they now know the difference between good and evil because they know what it means to do something against what God asks them to do. Does that make sense? And so for the first time, guilt, the awareness of a mistake, for the very first time, that enters humanity. So that is the sin that begins, at least in our earthly creation, according to the Bible. Now, they have babies, and they have two children, one named Cain, one named Abel. And in chapter 3, Cain kills Abel, which obviously is a problem. Abel is the preferred of the two. Cain's heart is not right. We're not sure why, but in the story of Genesis, we can go into detail about it. But Cain kills Abel because he is jealous of Abel. And so after that takes place, God deems it appropriate that you cannot have all of humankind coming from Cain's stock. So Adam and Eve have intercourse again, or at least they conceive again, and that baby's name is Seth, okay, which is the replacement for Abel. That's where chapter 5 begins. So let's look at chapter 5, beginning in verse 1. This is the list of the descendants of Adam, that when God created humankind, he made them in the likeness of God, male and female, he created them. And he blessed them and he named them humankind when they were created. And when Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his likeness, according to his image, and he named him Seth. Okay. The days of Adam after he became the father of Seth were 800 years. Don't get hung up on how long people live. We'll talk about that briefly, but not long. 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and then he died. So the next few verses of Genesis chapter 5 are the genealogy of Seth. Whose were Seth's kids, and so forth. Okay, so skip down to verse 18. Verse 18, chapter 5, and when Jared, and that's one of the descendants, had lived 162 years, he became the father of Enoch. Okay. Verse 21, when Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of, y'all see the name there? Methuselah. Y'all ever heard that name? And how do you hear that name in conjunction with what? Old as Methuselah. Well, Enoch, who is our topic of discussion tonight, is the father of Methuselah. Okay. And Enoch, this is verse 22, walked with God after the birth of Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God. Then he was no more because God took him. So Enoch becomes the first of two people in the Bible who do not die a natural death. Enoch is apparently just plucked up from the earth by God. The second one of those is Elijah. Elijah doesn't die either. He gets on a chariot of fire with flaming horses and he swoops up into heaven, which is pretty cool. But Enoch is the other one. Now, verse 25, when Methuselah had lived 187 years, he became the father of Lamech. Methuselah lived after the birth of Lamech for 782 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and then he died. Now, this is what's a little important here. Verse 28, chapter 5. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he became the father of a son, and he named him Noah, saying, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the toil of our hands. So Lamech's statement there becomes the first prayer. Now we're having to stretch it a little bit, but that because everybody's able to commune one-on-one with God. And what had happened is sin starts to populate on the world. It started with one, and then it kept spreading and spreading and spreading. Lamech basically says, God, we need relief and help. Let me be somebody who can do something about it. And so the way that God answers that is through the birth of Noah, who we know is going to be Noah's Ark, right? Okay, so skip down to chapter 6, and this is in Genesis chapter 6, verse 1. When the people began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God, which are angels, or yours might say watchers or some other form, the sons of God saw that they were fair, and they took wives for themselves and all that they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days will be numbered to 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards. They were when the sons of God went into the daughters of humans and bore children to them. So some group of angels were attracted to females on the earth, had intercourse with them, and bore a race of giants. That's what this says. Okay. And these were the heroes of old, the warriors of renown. So we have one giant in the Bible that most people at least know, who's Goliath. Yeah. So if we think about the David and Goliath story, what happens is the Philistines and the kingdom of Israel, which is led by King Saul, the first king. And Saul, by the way, is like 6'4" or something. The Philistines have in their army a soldier named Goliath, who is just massive, 7.5 feet tall or something. Just big brood of a man. And what they do is they decide, rather than our armies kill off each other, let's just put your best against our best. And so the Philistines say, we're going to put Goliath against your best. And what happens is everybody's lives are spared, right? The conquering army would absorb the army that they're facing. And so instead of having to kill them, they actually absorb them. They become bigger and more powerful. So there was a huge advantage if you did a warfare by best versus best. And that was fairly common. But Goliath is a massive bout of a man, and nobody in Israel's camp will come out because they're scared to death, including King Saul. One of the reasons they're scared to death is they think Goliath is a Nephilim. They think he is so big because he is born of angel and human, so that he's and there's plenty of Greek and Roman stories and heroes of this. Hercules is one. Odysseus is one. There's lots of them. But that they've got some kind of supernatural powers because they've got a tie into heaven. Okay, so that is our scripture. So let's look at verse 5 in chapter 6. That's the next verse. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the hearts was only evil continually. I love how the mind says that, but basically your Bible tries to paint it in one verse as being as bad as it possibly can be, that the whole earth. And when we're teaching Genesis, because I can't talk about what we're going to talk about tonight, because it's not in the Bible, what we're trying to do is a couple of things. Is that God is about to destroy the earth in a flood. He's going to ask Noah to build the ark. Noah builds the ark because he's the only good thing left on the earth. God allows him to incorporate his own family, which is his wife and then 2 sons and 2 daughters, or 3 sons and 2 daughters. So we think there was 8 of them maybe. And then the flood comes and they are saved because they're on the ark with all the animals and the lions and crickets and everything else. And so that's the story that's coming. Part of the issue in the Noah's Ark story when we're studying Genesis is it brings up thoughts of, will this ever happen again? Certainly it's going to be something, certainly it's going to be something in the hearts and minds of younger people that might be hearing it for the first time, or certainly it's in the mind of Noah that when the ark settles on dry ground, do I need to save this thing, God? I'm not going to build another stinking boat, 3 football fields long. So do I save it or not? I mean, that's what I would want to know. You've been floating around on the water for all that time and everything. And so God says, no, this is the promise. And so part of what we have to do when we're studying Genesis is we have to focus in on this Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, where it paints the world as being totally evil. Somebody in the early class said, well, we need a flood right now. Okay. But the thing is that the world has needed a lot of floods since this one. It's not just now. It was 2 years ago, 50 years ago, 80 years ago. You could go back and say, we need one there, we need one there, we need one there, we need one there, we need the one there. And the promise was that God's not going to do that again. Okay. And so, but the point being that the difference between the world now versus the difference then was that that the world was evil through and through. In fact, it was so evil that even angels who had fallen away from God were participating. Does that make sense? It was not just a natural evil. It was almost a supernatural, still under the control of God, and God could do anything he wants, but that it was just bad, 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 all bad. Okay. That's what we have in the Bible. We just read pieces of chapter 5 in Genesis, and then those first 5 verses of chapter 6. The thing is that do we have any more detail in the story? So that's where the book of Enoch comes in. So before I begin, just because of the Enoch is not a book in the Bible. It is not a book in the Bible because it's weird. It describes things that made our early church foremothers and fathers nervous. And I'm not talking just about Christians. I'm talking about Hebrews, because they're the ones that began with everything. That the supernatural stories of Enoch, which involves angels and involves demons, that it might be so misleading that people would begin to worship the beings themselves and not God. Okay. So this Enoch is not in the Bible, the Protestant Bible. It is not in the Roman Catholic Bible that has the Apocrypha in it, and it's not even in supporting documents. What it is it's an additional story that is very, very well known by our Hebrew brothers and sisters. For example, if I were to ask you to, in your mind, to envision what the Ark of the Covenant, the lost ark, looks like, most all of us are going to immediately envision Raiders of the Lost Ark with Harrison Ford and what that looked like, because that is so dominant in our culture. And so that if, for instance, our child says, what does the ark look like? And we say, oh, it's going to be gold, and it's going to have angels on top with their wings folded out, because we're thinking of something that is very prevalent in our culture. Enoch is very prevalent. It's a very, very prevalent story in early Hebrew texts. We have lots of things in our lives that have huge influence over how we view the world. If you think about the most perfect Christmas that could ever be, your vision of Christmas might be White Christmas with Bing Crosby. It might be Christmas Vacation with Chevy Chase. It could be a Christmas Story with Ralphie, the little boy. We could have all kinds of that. That would be, and it's because it's so endearing and so important in our culture. We have jokes about it and everything else. I mean, you can't have Christmas without talking about the Grinch, right? And we all know who the Grinch is because of Dr. Seuss and how important that is. It's a big deal as far as who we are as people, our culture. Enoch is a writing that is old and ancient. The entire thing was not found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but plenty of excerpts were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the Bible is full of references to Enoch. It's just that you don't know it. And we intentionally, pastors, don't call attention to it because we don't want you to go digging through it. We don't want you to go digging through this because this is freaky. Okay? Makes sense? And we certainly don't want anybody to go through it on their own because it's too easy for evil to slip in and create a doubt or an uncertainty that could create a problem. Okay? And the fact of the matter is that none of this matters in our walk with God. None of this matters in the history of salvation. It is not going to, if we believe some of it or don't believe some of it, it is not going to cast us to hell if we don't believe it or if we do believe it. And it's not going to get us into heaven if we do believe it or don't believe it. Does that make sense? It's additional material. I get asked all the time, Brock, why don't we know more? Why don't we hear more about the Nephilim and what all this is about? Enoch, and Enoch is 117 chapters long, by the way. We're going to look at 3 or 2.5 chapters of Enoch tonight, which is just a tiny piece of it. And it's the piece that fits into the Genesis chapter 6 story, because I think this is a story, Noah's Ark specifically, that most people know, at least in theory. You may not have known about what we just read, which is that angels came down from heaven and slept with human women and had children, and that was a race. A lot of people don't know that's in there, so don't feel weird if that's brand new to you. But the book of Enoch, starting in chapter, it depends if you're online and if you happen to come across a copy of Enoch. I'm going to try to give you what your copy is going to say, because my copy, which I've got for my people in person, is different. But basically, I'm going to be able to read the story to you and tell the story to you. So if you don't have a copy of Enoch in front of you, no sweat, you're going to be able to follow it just fine. So chapter 6, verse 1, or in the handouts, the very beginning, chapter 3, fallen angels. Do you see that front page of y'all's handout for those of you in person? And here we go. And it came to pass that when the children of men had multiplied in those days that were born unto them, beautiful and comely daughters, and the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them and said to one another, come, let us choose wives from among the children of men and beget us children. And Semjaza, never heard him before, was their leader, and unto them, and he said unto them, I fear you will not indeed agree to this, and I alone will have to pay the penalty of this great sin. And they all answered him and said, let us all swear an oath and bind ourselves by mutual imprecations to not abandon this plan, but to do this thing. So Semjaza came up with this idea, apparently, with his group of pals, and they all made a group oath that they would all go through with it so that he wouldn't be the only one that gets hung for his crimes. Okay? Then they swear all together, and they bound themselves by mutual imprecations about it. and they were all in 200 total, who descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon. Now, this is what's interesting. There are millions and millions and millions of angels. We're going to see that again here a little bit later on. So this is 200 of the angels, and they all make this deal. And they make this deal on the top of Mount Hermon. And Mount Hermon is famous for one thing in the Bible. One thing and one thing only. It is the Mount of Transfiguration, where Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up the mountain. And we talked about this in church a few weeks ago on Transfiguration Sunday before Lent began. And Jesus is transformed in front of them into this glowing image, and Moses and Elijah appear on the mountain up there with Jesus. And Peter says, "Oh my goodness, this is great. Let's build a monument or put tents up or something. We need to make sure that this is a hallowed place, blah, 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 blah." And there's a voice that comes down from heaven that says, "This is my son, the beloved." Okay, so it's a big moment. But it's interesting that on the same place where this takes place, and this, by the way, was written long before Jesus was there. In fact, this information of Enoch was extremely well known, not just by Jesus, but by all the disciples and almost everybody that's going to follow Jesus around who's Hebrew, because this is part of their culture. Okay. This is background information that they know that we don't know. Okay. They think that what we're reading is part of their history of how things came about, the presence of evil. This is the early Hebrew story of how evil comes out. Make sense? Okay. So Jesus knows this story. All the disciples know this story. They climb Mount Hermon, and Jesus happens to choose Mount Hermon for the Transfiguration. Does that change your view of the Transfiguration, knowing that that's the same place that these angels make their deal? Now, the thing is we could never say this from the pulpit, because then somebody might get the idea, I'm going to go look up that Enoch. And now I've got somebody going down a rabbit hole that ain't good and ain't healthy. Okay. Not to go down by yourself. Don't do that. Okay. It's not Alice in the Wonderland. Okay. So in Mount Hermon, they called it Mount Hermon because they swore and they bound themselves by the imprecations upon it. And then it lists about a dozen of these evil angels, and no, Satan, Lucifer, that is not in that list. So we're going to skip a verse. And all the others with them took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one, and they began to go into them and defile themselves with them. And they taught them charms and enchantments and the cutting of roots, and they made them acquainted with plants, and they became pregnant, and they bare great giants whose height was 3,000 ells, however big that is, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And then they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, to devour one another's flesh and to drink the blood. And then the earth laid accusations against the lawless ones. And Azazel taught men to make. So this is the first term that we see the word Azazel. And Azazel is actually something in the Bible. Azazel is in the book of Leviticus. In the book of Leviticus, it's the first four letters are Levi. Levi is one of the sons of Jacob, and that is one of the 12 tribes. And Levi is the tribe that is the church. So if you're going to be a priest, you have to be a Levite. Now, not all Levites have to be priests, but you have to be in that line. Okay. And in that, part of, depending on what sins we're talking about, you bring 2 goats to the church. Okay. You bring the perfect goat and you bring the imperfect goat for your sin offering. And the church keeps the perfect goat and lets the imperfect goat wander off into the wild. That imperfect goat is called the Azazel. We call it the scapegoat. Why is there a problem? Whose fault is it? The scapegoat, or Azazel. Okay. So Azazel in the story of Enoch is now going to become the leader. Why? We'll try to talk about that later, but there's not really a good reason about why Azazel is now going to be the leader. So all of this happens. So skip down to chapter 4 in your handout. If you happen to have a copy of Enoch, it's going to be 9:1. 9:1 is where this is going to be. But here's how it goes. And then Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel. So we have seen, these are angels. We have seen 3 of the 4 of these. So this page 1, we're on page 1, and I'm on chapter 4, which is just the bottom of that page on your handouts. And then Michael, Uriel, and Raphael, and Gabriel looked down from the heaven and saw much blood being shed upon the earth, and the lawlessness being wrought upon the earth. And they said to one another, the earth made without inhabitant cries the voice of their cryingest up to heaven. And now you, the most holy ones of heaven, the souls of men make their suit, say, bring our cause before the Most High. And they said to the Lord of ages, the Lord of lords, the God of gods, King of kings, and God, thou seest, and this is in verse 5, thou seest what Azazel hath done. In other words, they're talking to God. And when they approach God, they call God by all his proper titles, because that's what you do, even when you're a supreme angel. Thou seest what Azazel has done, who hath taught all unrighteousness on the earth, and revealed the eternal secrets which were in heaven, which men were striving to learn. And Salmazaz, who thought that he has given authority to bear over associates, and blah, 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 blah. Okay. So they tell God what was going on, but of course, God seemed to know it, but it's the angel's job to report back and forth. Skip down to verse 10 in your handouts, which is the middle of page 2. And if you happen to have a copy of Enoch, it's going to be in 9:4. And again, the Lord said, or replies to Raphael, bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness, and make an opening in the desert, which is Duodel, and cast him therein, and place him upon rough and jagged rocks, and cover him with darkness, and let him abide there forever, and cover his face that he may not see light. And on that day of great judgment, he shall be cast into the fire, and heal the earth which the angels have corrupted, and proclaim the healing of the earth, that they may heal the plague, and that all the children of men may not perish through all the secret things that the watchers have disclosed and have taught their sons. And the whole earth has been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel. To him ascribe all sin. So immediately there's a question of, is Azazel what we would call Satan? And that could be a yes, it could be a no, or it could be a maybe. That's how theologians describe it. Yes, no, or maybe. It's one of those 3 options, which are kind of the only options that exist. Okay. Verse 12. And to Gabriel. So that was God talking to Raphael. Do you remember what Raphael the angel did? Do you remember the donkey story? Balaam and the donkey and the talking donkey? That was Raphael that was in that story. Okay. Gabriel said to the Lord, proceed against the bastards and the reprobates, and against the children of fornication, and destroy the children of the watchers from amongst men, and send them one against the other, so that they may destroy each other in battle. And Verse 13. And the Lord said to Michael, which is a third of the angels, go to Salmazaz and his associates who have united themselves with women, and let them see the destruction of their beloved ones. And in those days, I'm skipping down a little bit to the end of verse 13. And in those days, they shall be led off to the abyss of fire, and to the torment of prison, in which they shall be confined forever. So in our simplicity, it'd be saying, so God is sending them to hell. They used to be angels in heaven, and now God is sending them into the fiery abyss, whatever that happens to be. Okay. verse 15, which is the bottom of that page 2. Or if you're looking at a copy of Enoch, we're going to be in 10:16. And here's how it goes: destroy all wrong from the face of the earth, and let every evil work come to an end. And let the plant of righteousness and truth appear, and it shall prove a blessing. The works of righteousness and truth shall be planted in truth and joy forevermore. And there shall be a righteous escape, and shall live to beget 10,000s of children in all the days of their youth and their old age, and they shall complete in peace. And then the whole earth shall be tilled in righteousness, and all will be planted with trees and full of blessings. Desirable trees will be planted on it, and vines and everything else. Verse 19, which is on the top of page 3. And cleanse thou the earth from all oppression and unrighteousness and all sin, and from all godlessness and all cleanliness that is wrought upon the earth, and destroy it from the earth. Okay, so we started with Noah's Ark story. How bad did the world get? It got awful. God's judgment being, we are going to wipe it out. We're going to wipe out the earth, and not completely wipe it out. Whereas, you say, well, if you take out everybody, then you could just have a Garden of Eden and put 2 people in it, and don't put a tree in there, right? Don't put like the tree of knowledge in there, and then problem solved, and nobody's ever going to sin again. But that's not what God directs, because God has such deep love for humankind. This is the inherent, this one thought about God's love for humankind. It is this thought that most theologians say is what steered the angels wrong. It wasn't lusting after humans. It was jealousy of humans, because God loved the humans so much that they were jealous of humans, and therefore wanted to exact their own will upon them. Or, and it could also be an they wanted humankind to worship themselves, the angels, instead of God. Okay? Because that was God's prized possession. So they either wanted to turn humankind away from God towards them, or mess up humankind so much that God wouldn't love them, wouldn't love humankind anymore. Does that make sense? Okay, that's the theory. Okay, so there's a lot of detail in here. There's a lot more stuff. Okay, so those of you online, is everybody, we kind of following along with how this story is going so far? This is a lot. Okay,
100%.
Yep, we're there.
Okay. So let's. So what God is going to bring the flood upon the earth. Okay, with Noah and all that kind of stuff. So let's skip down to verse 23, which is the middle of page 3 in your handouts. Okay, and remember Enoch, who was winding his own business, being a good man of God, and then God picked him up out of the earth. Here's what happens to Enoch after God picks him up out of earth, didn't kill him, and God brings him to heaven. And Enoch was blessing the Lord of majesty and the King of angels, and lo, the watchers called upon me, Enoch the scribe, and they said to me, and the watchers are the angels, okay? Enoch, thou scribe of righteousness, go and declare to the watchers of heaven, who have left the high heaven and the eternal place, and defiled themselves with women, and have done as the children of the earth do, take wives upon themselves. Say to them. So Enoch is receiving a message from the good angels to go give a message to the bad angels. And here is the message from the good to the bad. Say to them, you have wrought great destruction on the earth, and you will have no peace and no forgiveness of sin. Inasmuch as they delight themselves in their children, the murder of their beloved ones they shall see. This is what the good angels are telling Enoch to tell the bad angels. So here's what's happening, is Enoch is essentially becoming the mediator between good and bad. Okay. He's becoming the go-between because the bad can no longer be in the presence of God. So Enoch is delivering this message. Verse 25, inasmuch as they delight themselves in their children and the murder of their beloved ones, they shall see. So punishment number one, you're going to see the giants that you bore, you're going to see them die. That's what he's telling the bad angels. You're going to see your children die. And over the destruction of their children, they shall lament and they shall make supplication to eternity, but mercy and peace they will not attain. And Enoch went and said, Azazel, thou shalt have no peace, and a severe sentence has gone forth against thee to put thee in bonds, and thou shalt not have toleration nor request granted to thee because of the unrighteousness which thou hast taught, and because of all the works of godlessness and unrighteousness and sin which thou hast shown to men. And then I went and spoke to them all together, and they were all, this is Enoch, okay? I went and spoke to them all together, and they were all afraid, and fear and trembling seized them. So this is Enoch talking to the bad angels, and the bad angels are getting spooked. And they besought me to draw up a petition for them that they might find forgiveness, and to read their petition in the presence of the Lord of heaven. For from thenceforth they could not speak with him or lift up their eyes to heaven for the shame. So when Enoch delivers this message to the bad angels hire Enoch to go back to God and plead their case of forgiveness. Make sense? So that's who Enoch is. He's the go-between going from one side to the other. Okay? And so verse 30, and off I went and sat, this is Enoch, sat down at the waters of Dan in the land of Dan to the south and west of Hermon, and I read their petition till I fell asleep. And behold, a dream came to me, and visions fell down upon me, and I saw visions of chastisement, and a voice came bidding me to tell it to the sons of heaven and reprimand them. And when I awakened, I came into them, and they were all sitting together, weeping, which is, well, and with their faces covered. Verse 33. And I recounted before them all the visions which I had seen in sleep, and I began to speak the words of righteousness and to reprimand the heavenly watchers. Okay. So Enoch is going to tell them what he saw. Okay, so we'll go to verse 5, which is on the next page in your handouts. So it's page 4 on the handouts, verse 5. And here is what Enoch says to them after telling his dreams. Your petition will not be granted unto you, and from thenceforth you shall not ascend into heaven unto all eternity. And in bonds of the earth, the decree has gone forth to you to bind for all the days of the world. Okay. Previously, you shall have seen the destruction of your beloved sons, and ye shall have no pleasure in them, but they shall fall by the sword. Okay, so he's telling them again, you are not going to be forgiven. There is no hope for you. So, and that's the way that it's always going to be. So part of the parallel there is that these evil angels, or the angels who went bad, at one time had full communion with God and the rest of heaven. Now they have been cast out of heaven, and there is no way they can return. Okay. So if they can't go back to heaven, what is going to be the state of their existence? And that's kind of what the rest of this story is going to be about. Now, the next chunk of verses is Enoch goes back to God, and he has a vision of the throne. And it kind of sounds like the Revelation vision of throne, and it's really, really hard to understand. So let's see what God says when he approaches the throne. This is verse 21 in your handouts at the bottom of page 4. Or if you're online and you happen to have a copy of Enoch, this is 15:1. And God says, come hither, Enoch, and hear my word. And one of the holy ones came to me and waked me, and he made me rise up and approach the door. And I bowed myself, my face downward. And he answered and said to me, and I heard his voice, Fear not, Enoch, thou art a righteous man and scribe of righteousness. Approach hither and hear my voice. And go, say to the watchers of heaven, who have sent thee to intercede for them, you should intercede for men and not men for you. So what he's supposed to do is go back and tell the bad angels, you guys are supposed to intercede for humankind. You're supposed to be messengers from God to people. You are not supposed to send people to God, because that's what they're doing. They're sending Enoch to God. That's how desperate they are. Wherever have ye left the high, holy, and eternal heaven, and lain with women, and defiled yourselves with daughters of men, and taken to yourselves wives, and done like children of the earth, and begotten giants as your son? And so, and though you were holy and living eternal life, you blew it. Okay. And you bore these giants. That's the next few verses. Now we're going to skip to verse 30. That's on page 5. Or in Enoch, it's 15:11. And the spirits of giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work the destruction of the earth and cause trouble. And what this is that the giants, when they die, they go neither to heaven nor to hell, or Sheol for the Hebrew. Okay. The giants, remember the halves and halves? Make sense? Okay. When they die, and they're all being killed off. So if Goliath is one, when he dies, his soul neither goes to heaven nor hell. It is punished to wander the earth eternally. Okay. And in verse 30, and the spirits of the giants, they afflict, they oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth. And they cause trouble. They take no food, but nevertheless they hunger and thirst. So they're hungry and they're thirsty, but they can't eat and they can't drink. So their punishment is to wander the earth looking for safety or security or home or rest or something, and they are never granted it. Okay. So here's sort of what has happened in a nutshell. Because of sin, the angels, which we'll say Satan, because in Genesis, we didn't read this, but in Genesis, when humankind sins, when we take the apple off the tree, man gets 2 punishments, woman gets 2 punishments, and the tempter gets 2 punishments. Okay, 2, 2, and 2. The tempter's punishment is that instead of now being in the heavenly host, he is now instead of being the top of creation, he's the bottom creation. Okay, with no place to call home. Does that make sense? Okay. And what I'm telling you is I'm telling the story that would have been so well known in Hebrew culture and literature and in the minds and the hearts of Jesus's followers and disciples and everybody else, that this is what they believe, because the ark has to look like Indiana Jones' ark. Okay. This is in the hearts and minds of those people. And so these demons that wander the earth are always restless and always looking for a place to be. And sometimes in that place, that might be in a human being. This is ancient Hebrew belief. Because if somebody has a demon or is possessed, that demon had to come from somewhere. Does it make sense? Jesus casts out a demon or 2 or 3. We're going to read about it next week and the week after. We're going to read about some of this stuff. And the belief is that that demon that is in that person is one of these spirits from a dead giant. Does that make sense? Okay, that's the belief. So it is a actual power in their belief that sort of exists. All right. Okay. But they take no food. And these giants, this is verse 31, and these giant and these spirits shall rise up against the children of men and against women, because they have proceeded from them. And from the days of the slaughter and destruction and the death of the giants, from the souls whose flesh have gone forth, shall destroy without incurring judgment. And they shall destroy until the day of consummation, whatever and whatever. So that's the curse. So the angels who once were in heaven are cast out with no hope of ever returning, and they are going to be in great pain and suffering. The demons, who are the product of their sin, are also going to be in eternal torment, because they will never have rest, and they can't be in one place or the other. They're constantly running about the world, hungry, thirsty, tired, and they can't do anything about it. They just have to keep going and going and going and going. Okay. You with me so far? Isn't this weird? Yeah, this is weird. Okay. Chapter 6. This is 17:1, if you're following along in the book of Enoch. And angels they took and they brought me to a place in which there was a place like flaming fire. And when they wished, they appeared as men. So he sees these beings, Enoch does, that are flames, but also looks like people. One of our beliefs about angels is that there's a group of angels called seraphim. And the seraphim are apparently the ones that surround the throne of God, doing God's personal biddings. Like go wash God's car, go to the iPhone store for God, because nobody wants to go to the iPhone store, the Apple store, because that's like terrible, right? You don't want to do that. They do God's personal bidding. That is what Enoch is seeing. Okay, as he is seeing these flames, but they can appear as created beings when they want to. And they brought me to the place of darkness and to a mountain, to the point whose summit reached to heaven. And I saw the places of the luminaries and the treasuries of the stars and the thunder and the utmost depths, where there were a fiery bow and arrows with their quarry, and a fiery sword and all the lightnings. And they took me to the living waters and to the fire of the west, which receives every setting sun. So how do you explain a sunset on Longboat Key? Why is the sky in the west always bright orange? Because it is caused by the eternal fires. Right? Now, we know that ain't true, but you see, you've got to have an answer for sort of everything. Throughout Scripture, we encounter all kinds of references to this, okay, about why certain decisions are made, certain references, why they avoid certain sin or certain things, why they don't go to certain places, why they do go to certain places. And oftentimes it's going to be linked in something in culture, either out of the book of Enoch or some other cultural part of Jewish tradition that's been around for years and years and years and years. Now, as Christians, when the Christian world is putting together the Bible, trying to figure out what books you're going to have in the Bible, and this didn't begin until 325 AD. We didn't have this. It was the Council of Nicaea where they start. And in that meeting, they decided on a few things, but they didn't have a Bible figured out yet. And so they said, we have got to figure out the Bible. We have to know what is real and what is not. And so they assigned it to the person that they felt like would be the absolute best person in their group. Because at Nicaea, it was all of the greatest church hierarchy that existed. Constantine gave him an all-expense paid trip to Nicaea because people could not agree on certain theologies. One of them being Easter. What do we do at Easter? When do we have Easter? Christmas. What is Christmas? When do we have Christmas? All that sort of. So, is Jesus God? God, Holy Spirit God? Does that make sense? So the Council of Nicaea was basically called for three reasons: date of Easter, date of Christmas, and the Holy Trinity, to try to figure that out before they break up They say, we got to figure the Bible out like soon. And so they assigned it to a guy named Athanasius, who was the bishop of Alexandria, Africa. And Athanasius was brilliant, brilliant person. And he's got a great story of his own. He was really involved in Nicaea for some other stuff. He gets assigned the thing. And so he does like all good church leaders would do. And he forms a committee to study and figure out what needs to be in here, what needs to be in our Bibles. And it takes him 24 years. So in their next meeting in 354, which is the next time that the big meeting happens, 24 years later, they've got it together. This is what we think. And it's debated and approved. Okay. Certain things are left out of this. Enoch was never even considered. And the reason Enoch was never even considered is because the rabbis who take care of all the Jewish writings, the Torah and all of the Holy Hebrew Bible, the rabbis wouldn't even consider it. The rabbis said no. And one of the reasons that, or one of the check marks in do we include this in our Bible or not, is that if the rabbis didn't include it, we ain't going to include it either. Because if the early Jewish fathers, which would include Jesus, if they didn't think this was the word of God, see, because Jesus, like Isaiah, Jesus quotes Isaiah. Jesus doesn't quote Enoch. He'll quote something around it, but he won't. Does this make sense? So the rabbis never included Enoch either. So this would never have been included in the original Bible because it was never included in the original Torah. All it is just cultural information, stories about how things happen. One of the most controversial books that we have that made the cut, that was approved, is a book named Job. And it is everybody's favorite book in the whole wide world. Job. Job. So if you have a Bible, you can turn to Job. Job, the beginning of Job. Now, Job is really a great, great book. Okay. And so it's kind of like today. We wonder why the world has to have war, why the world has to have hunger, why don't people have clean drinking water? Okay. Why do bad things happen to good people? Okay. And, questions that everybody asks, why do we have to suffer? Why do some of the best human beings that have ever been on the earth, why did they have to suffer such horrible lives of torment or disease or cancer? Or why would the greatest couple in the world not ever be able to have a child? Or why would they lose their child in some tragic household accident? Does that make sense? Why does evil exist? That question's been around forever. Okay. That's part of what we're searching for. The book of Job is about a person that may be real or may not be real, but that doesn't really matter. The character Job is one of God's most faithful people. He's faithful. He's called, in fact, we can see how good Job was in Job chapter 1, verse 1. There once was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright. And blameless is reserved for only the greatest of all characters in the Bible. There ain't many people that get blameless, but Job is one of them. Okay. He's blameless and upright, and he feared God, and he turned away from evil. And there were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he had 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels and 500 yoke of oxen and 500 donkeys and very many servants. And he was the greatest man in all of the East. Job is a very good man, and he's absolutely loaded, and he's got lots of kids, and all the kids are good apples. Like none of them go south, I guess. Okay. So he's like living the life. Okay. Verse 6. in Job chapter 1. One day the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Now, what we do not have in Scripture or in Enoch or any of the supporting things is why and where the name Satan surfaces. The ancient Hebrew belief is that Satan is a reference to not one, but 200 evil spirits. That it is one name for all of them that fell out of heaven. Okay. Whether that's yours or not, or whether that's mine or not, doesn't matter. But I'm just kind of, we didn't have Satan in our earlier story. He wasn't listed among the bad angels. And Satan is obviously like the head of the bad angels when we thought it was Azazel. And so then you can go to Google, is Azazel and Satan the same? And Google's going to tell you, well, maybe. Yes, no, maybe. Here's the yes answer. Here's the no answer. Here's the maybe answer. Do we know? Nope. Does it matter? Nope. It don't. Okay. But here's what happens in the book of Job, which is in the Bible. And the Lord said to Satan, where have you come from, Satan? And answered the Lord. And he said, and Satan answered the Lord, from going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down upon it. Why is he going to and fro and up and down? It's not just because he's an angel, but he's wandering around if he's already fallen, right? He can't rest. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There was no one like him on the earth. Now, here is something very odd, and it can be confusing, and it is confusing, and it can be disturbing if you go too far with it. But let's think about it this way. If the reason that Satan and his comrades fell out of heaven is because they were jealous of God's love for humankind, if that's the argument, okay, that it's not just because the women are so pretty, it's because the angels, those were jealous of humankind, then God says, oh, by the way, have you seen, and Job is like the best of the best of the best. Have you seen that one down there? Because that one would drive the demons nuts. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. And so here's the response. Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. And then Satan answered the Lord, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and a house on all sides that he has and everything else? You've made him rich. You've given him good kids. He's got everything. There's nothing he wants. So of course he's going to praise you. And God said, oh yeah. And the devil says, yeah, if you make him poor, he will not worship you. And God said, oh, okay, go on, make him poor. And so that's what Satan does, is he makes Job poor. And Satan makes Job poor. And so now Job has the choice of does he stay faithful or not? And Job does. Okay. And then same thing. Oh, by the way, Satan, have you seen how Job, as poor as he is still faithful? And Satan says, yeah, but if you were to take away all of his family, then he ain't going to think so. Okay, Satan, take away his family. And so the family is removed and Job stays faithful. Okay. Oh, Satan, have you seen Job? Yes, but if you make him suffer, physical suffering, he will turn against you. And God says, okay, you think so? And that's what happens, is that Job is afflicted with sores and pains and everything else. So the book of Job, what it is about, is it's about several things. It is about how Job deals with all of this that's happened to him, because he was doing everything right, faithful and strong, and yet he lost all his money and he lost his family, and now his physical condition, emotional condition is in great peril. So how does Job, between chapter 1 and 2 through the end of Job, how does Job wander through suffering and stay faithful? And what you see is you see some great conversation. And that's pretty much, that is the whole box of Job. And so if you, not that everybody wants to do a Bible study on Job, I would never get anybody to that Bible study, by the way. Nobody, we're going to go see that. But what it is you see Job's conversations with God, his prayers, like, why God? Why? And then three people show up. Three of Job's friends show up. And they say, you know what? You've done something wrong. And the only way out of this is to confess what that sin is. And Job said, I ain't done nothing wrong. Said, yes, you have, because God would not do that to you unless you did something wrong. That makes sense? So they're trying to help, but they're really not helpful. So Job talks to these three guys. No, I've done nothing wrong, and I'm trying to stay. You should curse God to his face and blah, 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 blah. And then Job would go and pray, and he'll talk to God and say, God, why are you doing this to me? You know, then he shakes his fist at God. Why are you doing this to me? Does that make sense? And it's just a back and forth of Job's wandering through this whole thing of suffering. Why do we have to suffer? And how does it come in? How does it come out at the end? Well, yes, Job is restored to his health and all those sorts of things. But the problem of suffering of itself and where it comes from and why it is there, we don't have the answers for. What we have in the Bible, when they're trying to figure out what is good, because the rabbis included it, why would our ancient Christian forefathers include it? And then after that, you got to figure out why the Protestants would keep it when, you know, the Protestants are kicking books out that don't fit, like Tobit, like we did last week. And why do we keep it in there? It's because how do we deal with suffering? Okay. And whether Job is a historical figure, which we can say, yes, he is, but you don't even have to debate that. It's how do we get through challenging times? We remain faithful. Okay. We remain strong. And how all this stuff originates, whether it comes out of Enoch or not, really, it doesn't matter. It doesn't. I mean, it might help our curiosities, but it's not going to help our faith at all. I mean, all it does is maybe try to maybe give us an answer to a question I've thought about, but we don't even know if it's true or not. For one thing, it's not going to be in the Bible. And so we can't say, well, the truth is everything in there is exactly true. What we do know is that throughout the Bible, throughout the New Testament, this stuff is referred to and referenced by Peter, by Paul, by Jesus, by all kinds of people, talking about this very thing, about how some of this happened. Why does Jesus want to climb Mount Hermon in the first place for the Transfiguration? If it's not to put something big and beautiful on that one place that had been tainted forever, even if it wasn't a true story. Well, if this is Mount Hermon and if all this bad stuff happens, you know what we need to do? We need to bring God to the top of Mount Hermon and bless the whole mountain. That way it doesn't. Does that make sense? Okay. And so that's kind of where all of this stuff goes. Enoch is a very, very long story. There's a lot to it. And if the people online, if they looked it up, they know what I'm talking about. It's extremely lengthy. And there's lots of stuff in it. But the stuff that is in it is really purely for reference. What we're going to see next week is we're going to be in the Gospels the next 2 weeks. We're going to be in Luke chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11. And what we're going to see in that is we're going to see some of the presence of these demons. We're also going to see, okay, if somebody is born with a physical handicap, why? Okay. For instance, Jesus heals a blind man that had been blind since birth. And Jesus heals him, and the blind man goes to the priests in the church and says, I'm healed, I can see. And they said, oh, you were never really blind. Oh, yeah, I was. I've never been able to see, but now I can see. Well, they said, well, who did this? Well, that Jesus guy. Well, where is he? I don't know. I just know I can see now. They said, you were never. And so they called his parents. They said, who are your mom and dad? And he said, oh, Jack and, Sarah. Well, go get Jack and Sarah. And so they go get Jack and Sarah and bring Jack and Sarah. Are you his parents? Yes. Was he born blind? They said, yes. And they said, well, how can he see? And they said, we don't know. We weren't there. But he's never been able to see, and now he can see. The thought being that ailments and stuff were punishments for certain things. That while you were born with a certain thing, if you didn't have children, it's because you did something wrong and you were cursed. And that demons played a part in it. Or if you had some kind of physical handicap or emotional handicap or something else, why is it? Because somebody, your parents, did something wrong to create you wrong. And you are always filled with this thought of being possessed by something evil. Does that make sense? Because evil can mix up with the good, and it can produce something. Because when the bad angels, when they slept with human women who may have been innocent, they produced something bad, and God cursed those bad things forever. And so even if you think you're innocent, you're cursed because the people above you did. Does that make sense? That's the theology. That's the theology that is prevalent in the New Testament world. And you have to work through that when you're telling people about Jesus Christ, that none of that matters. None of that matters. It doesn't matter how rich you are. It doesn't matter how poor you are or hungry or how much food you got. It doesn't matter how good you are. Everybody can be invited. Doesn't matter how bad you've been. Everybody can be invited. That's one of the reasons that it was such a hard sell to the Hebrew community, because their whole lives they've been told that the ark has to look like Indiana Jones's ark, because you have no other way of, you don't know any different. You've never been taught anything different. We talked about it with Nicodemus on Sunday in church. Nicodemus knew a lot, and he was very well educated, but he didn't know the stuff that he had heard that Jesus was talking about. So he goes to Jesus at night and says, I don't know what you're talking about. And I'm like very well respected and high up and smart, and people come to me with their problems, but you're telling me stuff that I don't understand. And Jesus says, that's right. You don't understand it. And that's a shame, because you spent all of your life focusing on the wrong thing. Okay. So there we go. Isn't that fun? The book of Enoch, or 2.5 chapters of the book of Enoch. So if you hated it, throw it away, or save it and burn it or something, and use it for ashes on Ash Wednesday. But anyway, the important part is that the next 2 weeks we're going to be in the Gospels, and we're going to see Jesus and the disciples approach some of these people, some of these characters, and we're going to see healings take place. And you're going to be able to say, oh, I know why that blind person said this, or I know. Does that make sense? You're going to see things that you didn't really recognize that were there. And it's just because you have some context. The thing is that when we're preaching it and teaching it from the pulpit, I cannot say, oh, by the way, in the book of Enoch, it says that if you are missing your left thumb when you're born, it's because, that doesn't help anybody. That doesn't help anybody. And so we ain't going to talk about it. And it ain't biblical. And so I'm not going to bring it into it. So, but that's our thing on Book of Enoch. And so if you liked it, you can go back and rewatch this recording again, but you really would have to not have something else better to do. Or just come back next week. We have 2 more weeks left. We got March 11th and March 18th. And so we're going to be in Luke chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11 next week. And I don't know if you do participate in worship, our worship services, or at least my sermons, are kind of interwoven in here. And so if you haven't seen this past Sundays with Nicodemus in John 3:16, take a look at that. And you'll kind of see a little bit about how these kinds of stories are woven together. Thank you so much, everybody, for your patience. Thank you, everybody who is online. I appreciate that. And for those of you who have been joining us at another time and from another place, because lots of people are checking this out at another time, thank you for taking the time to look up the recording. We'll see you next week on March 11th. God bless you.
Thank you, Pastor Brock. Bye-bye.
Thank you.